Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Troy Moling and thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. Good to see you, and another week of 2020 almost in the books. Beginning the show today, and I'm sure that sometime over the last few weeks, many of the cow-calf operators watching took some time to look through their year-end numbers for 2019. Nebraska Extension Beef Educator Dr. Berger joined me on the show to explain what the most recent figures tell us and advice for producers looking ahead.
So for cow-calf producers, I think 2019 is going to be one that we're going to remember was pretty challenging, both from a production and a price standpoint. Obviously, production circumstances last spring were very difficult with the bomb cyclone, the very wet weather we had. Pretty high calf losses occurred, and that resulted in cow-calf producers having less calves to sell when they came to market this fall. Conjoined with that is we had some disappointing prices, and that when you have less product to sell and lower prices, economically, it was a pretty challenging year for cow-calf producers.
In terms of unit cost of production numbers, what do you see here? Where have they been and where do you see them going?
When we think about cost of production numbers, I think we are seeing them somewhat stabilize. We saw a really rapid increase over the last decade, especially in the early 2000s as we got into times where we had some better prices. We saw a run up in feed prices, specifically pasture prices in Nebraska. We've seen some of those moderate a little bit now. I think as we think about unit cost production, the three big things I see that really drive cost of production for cow-calf producers is number one, feed. About 40 to 70% of annual cow costs typically come in either grazed feed or harvested feed. Second would be overheads, and when I speak of overheads, I'm thinking about labor and equipment. And then the third would be cow depreciation. Those are the three big costs that typically drive the majority of cow-calf costs. So those are things that I see that are big ones. As we think about where those costs are, we've seen some of those moderate a little bit, but we continue to see some challenges, specifically I think on the labor and equipment side. Those things continue to be ones that are challenges for us from a cow-calf perspective.
What are some of your projections for 2020 producers?
In terms of cost of production, I think we're probably going to see things somewhat moderate a little bit in terms of where they are. I don't think we're going to see great increases in pasture prices. I think the spring is still ahead of us, so we're hoping for a different weather outlook than we had last year. Parts of the state are a little bit short on hay. There's other places where they have ample hay supplies. And so depending on where you're at, feed prices might be a little bit of an issue, especially if you're a little short on hay. As we think about what the price outlook looks like, again, I think we're hoping for better prices in 2020. We're going to have a smaller calf crop, I believe, coming to this town this fall in 2020, and so hopefully that'll be supportive of prices as we move through the rest of this year.
Aaron, are there cost areas that producers can think about reducing this year or in the years ahead?
So as we think about ways to reduce cost of production, in the January issue of the Beef Watch newsletter, we reviewed an article from Kansas State that really looked at some cow-calf enterprises that are part of their Farm Management Association. Interestingly, they broke those out into high profit, medium profit, and low profit. Those that are in their high profit group find ways to have good production with lower cost. And that's pretty intuitive, but we were looking at a difference of around $125 to $150 in feed costs between the high profit and low profit group. So paying attention to both how you're getting those cows fed, that's both grazed feed and harvested feed. They also tended to have lower overhead costs, things related to labor and equipment, as well as interest and depreciation. So those are ones to pay attention to as well. And then I think also just understanding what are some things that you might do from a marketing standpoint to capture more value for the product you have. How can you identify what the market wants, differentiate your products from others, and find ways to capture additional value?
Aaron also recommends that when prices are down, consider buying or retaining some replacement heifers to have in production for when prices increase. He also says to pay attention to the markets and look for opportunities to manage risk. We've posted the link to the Beef Watch article Aaron talked about in this interview on the Market Journal website. Staying with the cattle theme and keeping pregnant cattle well fed and in good shape is essential to the continuation of your herd. When thinking about what to feed these heifers over winter, there are a few things to consider. Market Journal's Maddie McIntosh sat down with an expert to learn more.
As we approach spring, many heifers are in their final months of pregnancy. This late gestation is the time where nutrition means the most to these cattle for a few different reasons.
Basically, if we think about during late gestation, we have a couple things that are going on. One of which is, of course, we're growing that calf in utero or inside of that cow. And in fact, this is one of the most crucial times for that calf's development or the calf's growth. So we can see impacts of how we feed that cow on how that calf performs. We typically suggest that we'd like her to be in a body condition score 5, and then heifers we actually want her to be in a 6. And the reason we target 5 is because we have great data that shows their body condition score at calving has a huge impact on how they rebreed. And so a 5, what we see is that we get about 88% conception for cows that are between 5 and 6 over a 60-day breeding period. But if we have them in a 4, we only get 69%. So it can have a huge impact on how many of those cows actually stay in the herd.
When it comes to supplementing nutrition for the cows, there is a difference between mature cows and bred heifers, or heifers that have not yet calved and are still young. The two groups should be separated so each cow is getting the right amount of nutrients.
Bred heifers are still growing, and they're developing a calf, so they actually have higher requirements. We say about 10 to 15% higher requirements than a mature cow. So if you don't separate them, then you either overfeed the mature cows or you underfeed the bred heifers. So a great idea is to separate out your bred heifers and maybe even bring in your first calf heifers. So those who have had one calf but are getting ready to calve for their second time, they're still also growing and have a little bit higher requirements than those mature cows. So putting those together makes you a nice group. So we typically say for, let's say, a 950-pound heifer, that's a pretty good target if your mature weight's 1,200, that we want her to be gaining about a pound a day. And so what she needs is about 10.6 pounds of TDN and about 1.9 pounds of crude protein. So if we, again, think about that as a forage, she needs something that's about 55% TDN and about 8.4% crude protein. So a lot of times, a good quality hay can meet her needs, but I do want to point out a lot of people think they have good quality hay. If they get it tested, they realize, boy, it's not where it should be. And so I would encourage everybody to think about testing hay. This year in particular was a bad year for getting hay up on time, so we have a lot more mature hay and the quality is not as good as I would like to see it.
With bred heifers, it is very important to maintain the correct supplement amounts to ensure the birthing process goes smoothly.
Bred heifers in particular, a lot of people think that if I don't feed a bred heifer as much, the calf will be smaller and then we'll actually have less calving difficulties. But the reverse is actually true. If we underfeed a bred heifer, we do get a smaller calf, but we also have a heifer who doesn't have as much muscle tone or as much energy to push that calf out. And so we actually see greater calving difficulties by underfeeding bred heifers, in addition to seeing those problems with her not conceiving because she doesn't actually start cycling again, as well as the fact that we may affect that calf's health and its ability to grow.
Mary also says that the kind of supplement used really depends on the operation. A better quality hay will mean less supplementation needed. And when in doubt, contact your local Nebraska Extension office for help. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Maddie McIntosh.
Thanks, Maddie. Mary recommends a distiller's grain as a good supplement due to the protein and energy it gives a cow, more than corn would. Next up, after last week's show taping, the long-awaited Phase 1 of the U.S. and China trade deal was signed. Now, this promises some pretty big changes for each country, and that includes the agricultural sector. For our weekly market segment, I was joined by Central Valley Ag's Luke Beckman for a breakdown of the deal and what we can expect from a marketing perspective.
I think that the agreement did a good job of cutting some red tape. There was a lot of language in there, Troy, about streamlining approval processes and eliminating non-tariff trade barriers. Some of those things are positive. I think when you look back at the market over previous years, we've had maybe some biotechnology traits that weren't approved, and it caused some issues in the marketplace. So read that to be a positive in phase one. Certainly the dollar amounts being confirmed based on what we saw several months ago was a positive. The market didn't see any details in terms of specific volumes by commodity. And so I think, the market was a shade disappointed by that, and we had a little bit of a buy the rumor, sell the fact type reaction, a week ago when that hit. But I certainly think it sets us up to get back to doing at least some normal business with China as it relates to soybeans. We shouldn't expect that any of that business is going to get done nearby as Brazil is starting to harvest their crop. But when we get to next fall, I think it really opens up the door to get back to some normal harvest type logistics.
And ethanol showed up with this agreement too. Why is that good news?
Well, for obvious reasons. China's been a buyer of U.S. ethanol in some pretty large chunks in some previous years, prior to some of the trade issues. And, it really helps with domestic demand when we think about corn. I think the question remains, are we going to export corn? How much corn may we export to China? But if we can get some ethanol into China, it certainly could increase and stabilize the ethanol industry in the U.S. We could maybe push another couple 100 million bushels into the the ethanol demand bucket here for the U.S. So strengthening domestic demand and creating a value-added product and then exporting that as ethanol or DDG certainly would be a positive for corn demand.
Yeah, so phase one, what's next? Is there going to be a phase two?
Well, that's certainly been the discussion. It sounds like some of those things are going to be pushed back until after the election this next fall. So I think the question is, will we see more details as it relates to phase one? I don't know that we're going to see a list of volumes specific to what we can expect to export. I think where it shows its head first is probably in the cash markets. And I think you'll feel that, in the PNW and the U.S. Gulf, and that'll trickle back up the supply chain. So we'll feel it in a lot of different places, but I think you'll see it first in the cash market.
Okay, and let's move on to South America now. So fill us in on the delays that is happening down there and if the U.S. market could see any opportunities as a result of those delays.
It's possible. Brazil had soybean plantings go in a little bit later than what they would have liked. They're just getting started with soybean harvest now. Early reports are the yields are pretty good. What it does is it pushes back their safrinha corn planting. And that's a kind of a dicey situation, or can be. They don't want to get too far back in the calendar because then that crop's going to be pollinating in some adverse conditions and potentially doesn't or won't finish. 70% of Brazil's corn production comes from their second crop. They've had some dry, heat-like conditions for that first corn crop. I don't think the market's too concerned about that because they're well aware that the second crop corn can make that up rather quickly. So it's a situation we need to watch. As of right now, the production seems to be stable. The USDA hasn't acknowledged any major problems, and they're forecasted to have a really nice soybean crop.
Okay, so with the January crop report now out of the way, next major report is going to be in March when we look at acres. So do you have a thought as to where you think farmers will be in 2020 on that regard?
Well, I think you can expect that corn acres and bean acres on that report are going to be up. We had, a 19 million acre dip between 18 and 19 because of all of the wet weather last year. So at least on paper, the intentions or what we intend to plant is going to go up. So corn acres, prognosticators are going to put that anywhere between 92 and 95 million. And soybean acres probably 83 to 86. So we're going to see corn and bean acres go up. The wheat market's been positive, had a positive run lately. So hopefully, maybe that steals some acres for some spring wheat. But we can expect acres to be up. And at that point, you really put a trendline yield on the number, and you're going to be able to extrapolate what production is going to look like for 2020. So from a supply side, the market is going to be drugged down by that a little bit. The what if, of course, is what does demand look like? And we just don't know that with the phase one. The USDA may give us a couple 100 million bushel bump, in corn and something similar in soybeans. Keep in mind, we don't see demand estimates for the 20 crop from the USDA until May. So there's a lot of waiting to do, and seasonally, we would expect some good prices as we get into after that report and beyond.
All right, and finally today, Luke, let's hear your price forecast for corn and soybeans, and if there's any other advice you'd like to share for us as well, go for it.
Sure. Well, I think corn at $4 basis the December, $4 basis the July, those are really good values compared to previous years. And I know everybody wants to be patient, not knowing what phase one could mean for the corn or soybean markets, but I think it's also a good risk management principle to just look at the price and say, hey, I know that my break even is X, and if the market's giving you an opportunity to sell at a profit, whether that's old or new crop, you really should reduce some risk in a percentage of those crops and take it. So $4 D corn, if you haven't sold that yet, sell some. Soybeans, they got up to the 980s on the Nove futures, and they've been reeling a little bit here lately, but $9 cash for next harvest seems to be a popular spot for producers. I think we've got a chance to see that again. You need to get your orders working and let the market go get it.
Thanks again to Luke for stopping by. Next week, we'll be joined by Doug Simon with Trados. If you have a question you'd like for me to ask him, email us or get in touch on social media, and I'll pass your question along. Time now for this week's trivia question. Let's see if you can get it. Here we go. 1 bushel of corn produces enough syrup to sweeten approximately how many cans of soda? Is it A, 275, B, 325, C, 350, or is it D, 450? Make your selection and I'll have the answer in just a couple minutes. It's time now for weather with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. Al, Old Man Winter came for a visit this week. How long is he going to be hanging around?
Well, Troy, you're exactly right. Old Man Winter came back with a fashion this week. We have seen a very warm start to the first of the part of the month in terms of January. And this cold air that came in actually has brought parts of north central, and northeastern Nebraska to the below normal category for the month so far. Of course, when you're running 15 to 20 degrees below normal on average temperatures, it does make a significant difference in your monthly total. But more importantly, we went through a wild string of weather, at least across the eastern half of the state, starting to snow as we got in the early part of the week, changing over to icing conditions, rain, back to ice, back to snow, get a break for 24 hours, repeat the process. Many of the residential areas in Lincoln and Omaha really were very, very icy due to these constrictions. And then, of course, we started to see the warm-up as we got into Thursday, for Wednesday and Thursday, that helped to melt some of those, and then we put the snow back on top of it. So quite a wild weather week. It looks like we may have a little bit more in store, but maybe toward the drier side. So as we look at the upper air models, first thing is that we have a trough moving across the northern plains and a slight trough moving across the central southern plains, and Nebraska kind of caught between these two troughing patterns. Overall, though, we are dominated by high pressure here in the center part of the country, with low pressure at the surface to our south and low pressure to the surface to our north. The main weather maker, though, is over the eastern seaboard, and that is basically causing the light snow and moderate snows to our east. We're more in a dry trend. Now, as we go into Sunday, we're going to get a slight northwest flow. There is a couple pieces of energy moving out of that northwest flow. I think primarily if we have any impact from this, it'll be over the Panhandle. Even that's a low-risk chance, with most of the activity staying toward our north. On Monday, we start to see a trough deepening in the southern plains, and this one will be one to watch out for as low pressure starts to develop over the Texas Panhandle. Current projections are that will slide just to the south of Nebraska, but if any northward placement of this, and we will see much more significant weather come midweek. But most of the activity at this time appears by Tuesday to move over into the South Gulf Coast state region. We do have a couple of low pressure systems indicated to develop at the surface Tuesday, particularly over eastern Montana and over northeastern Colorado. As a piece of energy tries to slide down the northern stream into the northern Rockies, we should not see much in the way of precipitation until we get into Wednesday, when we start to see this trough deepen toward the Texas Panhandle, and that may allow us to see some upslope flow conditions develop across the Texas Panhandle, across the Nebraska Panhandle. Further to the east, though, we're going to have to wait for this system to bottom out in Texas and then see where its direction is. Right now, it looks like it's just going to skirt to our east-southeast as that low pressure in deep Texas starts to move toward the Great Lakes region. Low pressure in the Texas or into the northeastern Colorado will initiate some upslope flow, but the vast majority of our precipitation will remain to our south, and then it'll start to swing toward the east. We'll get into a little bit of northerly flow, a little bit cooler weather as we get into later next week, but overall, once that high pressure passes to us, it looks like we're going to see some warmer weather return, specifically from the western part of the state, and it's gradually overwhelming the eastern part of the state. So we're going to go basically a little bit warmer during this next week, and then things start to fall apart rather rapidly. 8 to 14-day forecast does show above normal temperatures across the United States. I think this is probably overdone in the northern plains. I think a little cooler trend is more likely with that big trough. In terms of precipitation, most of the energy that's going to move across as we go from next weekend to the following week is going to go across the northern plains with Nebraska at the southern end. So overall, it looks like a much better pattern over this next 7 days. We do have some precipitation chances, particularly the western half and southern part of the state, as we get into the middle of next week, but even that at this point in time looks fairly remote. So overall, Troy, much better conditions as we go forward, but we'll keep an eye on that storm coming out in the middle of next week.
Thanks, Al. Back to trivia now, and this week we asked, 1 bushel of corn produces enough syrup to sweeten approximately how many cans of soda? The answer is B, 325 cans. Can you believe that? Next up, 2019 brought quite a few income burdens for many ag producers, and in many cases, financial assistance helped soften the blow from weather disasters or trade tariffs. Now, with a lot of big changes in the works with global trade, many are starting to see a silver lining, but there's still a lot to unpack. This week, Market Journal's Bill Dodd caught up with UNL farm policy expert Brad Lubben to see why he says the outlook for 2020 is still a little hazy. Bill, what have you got your eye on this week?
Well, thanks, Troy. You're absolutely right there. Brad tells me the outlook for 2020 is just a bit cloudy. Now, while we had great news last week on the trade front with the passage of the USMCA trade agreement, as well as phase 1 of the China trade deal, while there was uncertainty coming into the new year about having these trade agreements solidified, now that they're going to be put into practice, there are going to be a number of details that producers are going to want to keep an eye on as the year begins to unfold.
While the USMCA and Phase 1 trade agreements appear to be solidified in the books and commodity prices could be looking to trend upward in the coming months, Brad remains cautiously optimistic as he points out with the Phase 1 deal that there's still a lot of work to be done before we're completely out of the woods.
You know, the trade outlook here at the beginning of 2020 has actually gotten much stronger than we might have imagined just a couple months ago. The U.S.-Japan agreement is in effect. The U.S.-European Union agreement on expanded access for non-hormone fed beef is in effect, and so we begin to hope for improved markets and improved opportunities for U.S. ag producers to export product to those markets. And then you have phase 1 of this ongoing trade agreement and negotiations with China. Having an agreement is simply a good sign that we're not proceeding further down the path of trade conflict, but yet we still see a lot of work ahead here. The agreement promises great things for agriculture if in fact it would come to pass. Advertised rates or growth up to 40 billion of U.S. ag exports on average over the next 2 years. That would be essentially double what we currently have exported to China before the trade war began. So certainly substantial growth, substantial opportunity, if it does in fact come to pass. It's important to remember that trade 1 or phase 1 really is only the beginning of discussions, and some of the same basic conflicts and challenges that precipitated the trade war are still there.
Agricultural risk coverage and price loss coverage, or ARC and PLC, have been a big help with many of the troubles that ag producers have faced in the previous year. However, Brad tells me that these new trade agreements could affect commodity prices, which could in turn influence your decision on which of these programs could best serve your operation.
As we look through the year of 2020, we have market prices that at the moment are a little bit stronger, and with perhaps some trade prospects could become a little bit stronger yet. They're at price levels, particularly for corn and soybeans, that would not trigger either ARC or PLC payments. So it's good to have market prices up. It's good to have farm income projections up from the marketplace. It's a reminder that we may not see much in terms of farm program payments during 2020. Those are good signs to not be as reliant on that farm and trade assistance. But it's a reminder that that cash flow that was there the last couple of years may not be there this year, and it's a reminder to plan accordingly.
Beyond trade and farm policy, the biofuels industry had a topsy-turvy year in 2019. It started with a bang as President Trump made good on his promise for year-round sales of E15 and a promising deal with industry leaders in October. However, much of that progress was stymied by the record number of small refinery exemptions, or SREs, granted by the EPA. According to many professionals within the ethanol industry, these exemptions have led to a reduction of production and continued to affect commodity prices for producers in a time when they were under significant financial strain. With the renewable fuel standard set to change in 2023, there's still a lot of uncertainty within the biofuel industry.
You know, on the bioenergy front, we have really almost an existential crisis for the renewable fuel standard. You have a mandate that was passed in Congress back in '05 and again in '07. You have a mandate that specifically was designed to force increased consumption and utilization of biofuels. You have an industry in the petroleum industry that fundamentally is against the idea of a mandate, and particularly against the idea of increased share for a biofuel sector. And so there's always been a friction over the performance and the future of that renewable fuel standard. If it forces higher levels of consumption as per the original legislative intent, then that might involve economic pain. And yet the same legislation had clauses that said if there's economic pain, then we can consider waivers or repeals of the legislation. So we have really this fundamental question about what the future holds. And that doesn't even begin to address the question of the current renewable fuel standard technically only runs through 2022. The future of the RFS in 2023 and beyond is really certainly up for debate. And how we perform now definitely leads into a discussion of what's ahead.
So Troy, with a lot of good news coming from Washington last week, it should probably be taken with a small grain of salt, as there's still a lot of uncertainty as far as trade and policy are concerned for the new year. But we're going to be sure to keep our eye on the updates as they come, and for now, I'll send it back to you.
Thanks a lot, Bill. That's going to do it for this week's show. If you missed a story, remember you can download the Market Journal mobile app or follow us on social media to join in on the conversation. Next week, with calving around the corner for some, we'll offer a few tips to make it go as smoothly as possible. Plus, sleep deprivation is an issue for many farmers this time of year. We'll examine it. Hope to see you right back here next time. I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.